In the choreography of Undressing, A Love by the River, intimacy becomes a learned rhythm. Small gestures, shared work, and the quiet pauses where desire gathers strength. Marina and Tomas move through a slow-burning dance of tenderness, rebuilding trust and love in the spaces between their days. Each moment becomes a step in their private choreography, a testament to how two people learn to stay. If these stories pull at your heart, subscribe and tap the bell so they find you again. Lisbon in late autumn smelled of sea salt and frying almonds, the kind of weather that made people lean closer to one another without meaning to. Marina Vale stood on the terrace of the small municipal registry office and watched the river move like a silver ribbon. She had worn a dress that was quietly elegant, the color of whetstone, and her hair was braided down her back like a rope. At 33 she had learned the language of small economies, budgets, favors, the tidy arithmetic of promises exchanged to settle debts and open doors. The marriage she was about to enter was not the end of hope, but a ledger that might buy time for the programs she had built from noon through midnight, free dance classes, creative writing nights, a weekend kitchen that fed volunteers and anyone who arrived without funds and with hunger in their hands. Across from her stood Tomas Duarte, 38, with hands that had become skilled at restoring old wood and at folding heat into compact decisions. He was known in his family as a practical man, the kind who measured twice and cut once, the kind who could calm a contractor by naming an obscure varnish and thereby make the contractor see him as someone who belonged in the room. He had agreed to the marriage because his uncle, a city councilman, had asked for a stable household to anchor a civic grant. Thomas's project, a plan to restore a derelict boathouse into a cultural commons, needed the legitimacy that a married surname could help summon. He had not sought romance, he had sought the quiet scaffolding that would allow him to work in peace. They signed sheets of paper and posed for photographs with strangers who clapped and said congratulations as if applause could rearrange the shape of life. Then they moved into a compact townhouse that smelled of lemon oil and old paper, a place where the floors had the gentle complaint of a house that had lived many seasons. Marina unboxed jars of spices and matchboxes with local band stickers, while Tomas arranged tools and books with a patience that seemed almost meditative. They kept separate bedrooms at first, a tacit agreement that allowed their newness to hold a soft border. The first nights were an exercise in public performance. They attended dinners and openings together, smiling where needed, exchanging polite kisses after a long day. Yet the ledger they had traded for ease included clauses that were not on any official paper: consent, boundaries, an understanding that the marriage was a partnership in practical terms before it became a personal one. Tomas proposed, quietly, that they make a pact in ink and paper. Marina, whose work involved paperwork for city permits and funding, drafted a page of small rules and gifts. They set aside a ritual. Once a week they would cook a meal together, no phones allowed, no visitors, a small island where the day could be counted and notated by taste. It was during one of those dinners, a stew made with local chorizo and white beans, that an unplanned brush of hands stretched into a linger. Marina had been stirring and her sleeve split at the cuff. Tomas reached to help, fingers grazing her wrist. The touch was small and casual, but it left a warmth that did not belong to the broth. They both paused, the sound of the city faint through the window. Marina found that she liked the way his thumb pressed a map of small circles on the inside of her wrist, as if he were reading a secret itinerary. Tomas, for his part, discovered that when she looked at him like that, Curious, slightly amused, something in his chest unlatched a reserve he had kept tidy for years. Their nights developed rules and exceptions. A rule stayed a rule until a feeling suggested it could be bent. Tomas began leaving a cup of coffee where she would find it when she woke, precisely the way she took it, black with a single stubborn spoon of cinnamon. Marina started to place small notes inside his toolboxes, slips of paper with lines of poems that made him smile the way someone does when they find a hidden photograph in a book. The house filled with these minor conspiracies, a sweater draped over a chair, a plate left with one extra olive, the slow accumulation of meanings in objects that signaled care. Marina taught weekly dance classes in a loft that had been loaned by the municipality. The classes were for women and men who wanted to move without judgment, to learn how the body might be a refuge rather than a battleground. Tomas sometimes came at the end of a session and watched from a shadowed corner, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his jaw slowly losing its habitual tension as bodies moved and freed themselves. One evening, when the room smelled of sweat and eucalyptus, a stray hand brushed Marina's waist while she corrected a posture. And the memory of that contact, public, brief, electric, stayed with her long after the hall emptied. She went home smelling of studio dust and paint, and Tomas greeted her at the threshold with a towel and a look of something like pride. Their physical intimacy grew in increments that were deliberate and mutual. There was a night when the rain came in sheets and the city turned its face inward. They stood on the small kitchen balcony, close, sharing the thin heat of one umbrella. Tomas brushed the rain from the edge of her hair and the gesture edged toward a kiss. Marina, feeling the momentum, leaned in. Their mouths met in a slow, exploratory pressure that fit more like a promise than a claim. It was not a rush to consummate a contract. It was instead two adults learning the coordinates of one another's hunger. The kiss deepened, edged into his jaw, and then retreated as if the body itself had set a gentle limit and then bent it again the next breath. After that night, their touches became more deliberate. They learned contours of preference, where a hand on the back calmed, how a firm palm at the small of the waist could be in anchor, what length of stroke along the arm elicited a laugh. They learned the choreography of undressing slowly, in which each removed piece of clothing was a small ceremony of consent. Marina liked the way Tomas moved his hands as if he were arranging a plaster sculpture. Tomas liked the way Marina's breathing altered when he leaned into the hollow at the base of her throat. They discovered that the house had rooms that kept secrets between their walls, a conservatory warmed by sunlight, a narrow attic with a mattress and curtains that blocked the worst of the dawn light, a bathroom where mirrors amplified their shapes and made them look like another, younger self. There was a scene in the conservatory that they both remembered, a night thick with garden smells and the slow hum of insects kept at bay by the glass. Tomas had been repairing an antique music box and Marina had been trimming plants. A storm had pushed the temperature down and they closed the door against the cold. She was bent over a pot and felt his hand at the small of her back, a steadying touch that spread heat as if it carried its own flame. He leaned in and breathed against her ear. Voice low. He said her name not as a label but as an invitation. She turned on a heel, and there, beneath the warm lamplight, they kissed until the world narrowed to the soft press of skin and the steady music of their lungs. It was a kind of intimacy that left both of them staggered and amused, as if surprised by their own appetite and delighted by it. Public life tested them. Tomas's uncle, who had been the instigator of the municipal grant, was a man who expected certain appearances and alliances. Marina's past had been one of effort and scrappy persistence, nothing that flashed with prestige. Some in Tomas's circle sniffed at her origins, at the fact that she ran a community kitchen and taught dance for little pay. There were invitations declined and polite probes at dinner parties where the host would ask what Marina did for work and then look past her when she replied. Tomas, who had once accepted such slights with a quiet stoicism, found himself standing straighter now. He corrected bemused interlocutors, introduced Marina with a steadiness that made a knot of air around them untangle. Whenever someone made a sharp joke about their arrangement being merely practical, he would take her hand under the table, and the squeeze would say something like, "Claim without spectacle." The twist that altered the geometry of their lives arrived like a package. At midnight, a small, anonymous envelope was slid under their front door containing photographs and a note. The photographs showed Tomas at a distance, in a city square months earlier, holding a stack of leaflets and handing them to young people. He was not in any official capacity, he was handing out invitations to an underground poetry night that had supported fledgling writers and musicians. The note was simple. People do things for love, even when they do not say the word aloud. They learned then that both of them had private projects of clandestine generosity. Tomas had been the anonymous patron of the poetry nights because, in his youth, he had been saved by someone who believed in him enough to buy a ticket to a concert he could not afford. Marina, in contrast, had been a performer in an improvised troupe years before, dancing in alleys and on staircases to test the edges of how bodies made spaces feel safe. They had been part of the city's secret life and each had protected the other without knowing. The revelation shifted their intimacy into a new register of tenderness. They shared stories of nights they had spent handing out food, of the look on a young poet's face when someone applauded for the first time, of their small economy of hope passed from hand to hand. Their hands met on the table and did not leave for a long time, as if their palms were making a map that had no destination but which named a route. With each shared secret, their physical language grew richer. They flirted in public in small, calculated ways. A brush of an arm here, a finger trailing an index along the rim of a glass there. They held hands walking through rainy streets, bodies close enough such that the heat between them felt like a private furnace shielding them from public cold. At nights their kisses became more urgent sometimes, the kind that happened when sleep refused to come and the body's answer had to be immediate. Once, after a long day when a permit had been finally approved and their boathouse restoration money had been transferred, they celebrated by collapsing into bed, laughing and panting, in a way that made them both feel like partners in a small, illicit joy. Yet, tenderness sequenced itself with a clear respect for edges. They never crossed a line that either of them had marked as off-limits. There were negotiations, whispered and slow, about rooms and moments that belonged only to one person. Tomas kept a small stack of letters from his mother in a box he would not open on certain days. Marina respected that privacy the way one protects a small shrine. Marina kept an old cassette tape of a song she could not bear to throw away, and Tomas knew not to ask about the woman who might have been the original owner of that tape. They had boundaries that did not feel like fences but rather the carefully plotted edges of a garden where each plant was allowed to grow without strangling another. Their work rippled outward. The boathouse opened as a weekend commons where dancers rehearsed and poets recited. The municipal council praised the Restoration as a model of public-private partnership. The community kitchen, modestly expanded, fed more families. Marina received word that a donor wanted to fund a satellite program, and she wept. Alone in the supply room, the tears salty and faint like the sea air. Tomas found her there and simply held her, his hands warm at the small of her back, steadying like a seam. 3 years into their marriage, an illness in Tomas's family demanded attention and trimmed the margins of their life. He traveled to care for his uncle and left Marina with the boathouse and a stack of decisions. The distance was a test but also a revelation. Absence had taught them to trust the threads that held them. They wrote letters rather than text messages on some days, sentences that felt like small gifts, and read them aloud to one another on video calls. When Tomas returned, more tired than she had seen him in years, Marina greeted him at the small ferry with a scarf and a kiss that tasted like sun-warmed bread and something older. Their private world did not only consist of tenderness. There were nights of jealousy when old flames or opportunistic friends returned seeking favors or recognition, and Marina had to guard their partnership from those who assumed a marriage was an open invitation to meddle. There were bureaucratic battles for funding and petty articles in local papers that questioned Marina's competence because she was a woman who loved to wear paint-stained jeans. Each difficulty knitted them closer in the way that hard weather makes fabric thicken and fit better. The steamiest nights were quiet and inventive. Tomas learned the way. Marina liked to be held. A slow, steady pressure behind the ribs that anchored rather than consumed. Marina learned to trail kisses from the collarbone down the slope of Tomas's chest in a rhythm that made them both laugh and shiver. Once, in the attic bedroom, when the house outside sang with rain and the wind made the old windows chant, they moved together with a syncopation that was patient and fierce, like dancers who knew the steps and could improvise when needed. Neither of them rushed the other. Both of them listened with a kind of hunger that was not only physical but also a hunger for the assurance of being seen and chosen. As the city prepared for a winter festival, their public work was showcased, and Tomas and Marina stood under strings of lights, holding hands. A reporter asked them to reflect on partnership in front of a camera, and Tomas simply said, hands tightening in hers, that partnership was an act of daily courage, the choice to appear for someone else in small things. Marina added that love could be fierce and restful at the same time if tended with honesty and small luxuries. The interviewer nodded as if they had been given a formula. There is no perfect ending for grown people who stay in the world, only arrangements that become more generous. On the 5th winter of their marriage, the boathouse hosted a midnight dance that was a benefit for the city's shelters. The heat from the crowd made the wooden beams sing, and Marina danced until her feet ached. Tomas watched from the edge, his chest full, and then went to her and took her in his arms. They moved like two hands interlaced, not because of duty but because motion had become their language. When the night ended, they slipped away from the lamps and the music and walked along the river, bodies close under a single coat. Breath making small fogs in the cold. Back home, they indulged in a routine that felt like a private holiday. A long bath fragrant with citrus, a slow meal shared in the dim light, and a conversation about future projects that sounded like plans for a life they had decided to keep building together. They spoke softly of the years ahead, of more festivals and more small programs, and of the quiet hope that their work would leave a city a little more generous. Tomas, catching the light on her face, pressed a final kiss to her mouth, and it felt like the closing of a line and the opening of the next. Their story did not resolve into a final neatness, instead it continued along a line of small commitments made daily. They had learned to be ardent without greed, to hold one another without possessing. The ledger that once felt like a contract had become a book of practices for a life they co-authored. The steamy afternoons and winter nights were woven into the larger cloth of purposeful life, and together they kept adding stitches. Winter loosened into a pale spring and then into a summer that smelled of salt and hot tar. They had learned, in the quiet arithmetic of months, to place the kinds of bets that paid out slowly. The boathouse project became not only a visible ribbon of wood and glass on the river but a living ledger of small successes that multiplied in ways neither of them had predicted. The weekend commons that Thomas had envisioned now hosted not only rehearsals and open readings but also night schools where retired craftspeople taught young apprentices how to plane a board, how to read the grain of timber, and coax out its voice. Marina's kitchen moved from feeding a handful of hungry neighbors to coordinating occasional meals that fed hundreds, where volunteers learned the economy of a single pot, of how a handful of herbs could be an act of love that stretched decades. A child arrived one spring with a name like a little song, Lena, and she clung to Thomas as if he were a ladder and to Marina as if she were the sky. Not their child by any contract but a neighbor's, left in the care of someone who couldn't hold both a job and a home that week. They took Lena for a few days and she stayed for a few months and then longer. The little rhythms that had once belonged to two adults extended themselves into adjustments, a softening of schedules, a new inventory of permissions. Can she have the red mug? And a shared repertoire of stories to tell at bedtime. Thomas learned to braid crumbs into shapes on a plate, to build a pirate ship from a discarded drawer, to sing off-key with a voice that made Lena clap her hands. Marina discovered that the small courtesies she had cultivated in public work, patience, an ability to explain complicated things in plain sentences, became a kind of magic at calming a restless child. Parenting by accident revealed tender vulnerabilities and stubborn love. Lena's mother, Anna, was a receptionist who worked the night shift and whose apartment leaked when the rain came too hard. She expressed her gratitude in nervous smiles and in the occasional cup of stale coffee pressed into their hand. She did not want to be judged, and Marina and Thomas did not judge. Instead, they invented a way of helping that preserved Anna's dignity. They fixed her window frame without fanfare. They organized a roster so Lena could stay with them when Anna had a double shift, and they kept their home a place where a child could empty a cupboard and not be scolded for the inevitable mess. Because their marriage had begun as a practical scaffolding, it was capacious enough to hold this improvisation. The ledger proved flexible. As Lena settled, Marina found that her teaching practice expanded in little, generous ways. She began a class for parents and children, where toddlers learned rhythm by banging spoons on tins and parents relearned the permission to make mistakes. Thomas built a set of low benches for the class that doubled as storage for costumes and props. The boathouse's roof, which once had been only a place to peg tools, became a sunny platform for afternoon naps and a site for small celebrations. People who had once seen the boathouse as an unlikely civic project now treated it as a neighborhood hearth, but growth carried with it new pressures. A developer with an eye for prestige proposed a competing plan for the riverbank, a glossy, gated promenade whose renderings suggested order, clean lines, and the kind of architectural silence that smelled faintly of money. The plan offered the city more revenue and fewer complications. Thomas and Marina, along with a coalition of artists and neighbors, mounted a campaign to protect the boathouse's public purpose. They wrote to council members, they staged a midnight dance that spilled onto the river steps so that officials could see bodies and laughter, rather than only spreadsheets. The developer's lobby offered to underwrite part of the boathouse if Tomas and Marina would agree to a formal partnership that would place a glossy brand store at one end of the commons. Tomas refused. Marina argued in public meetings with an eloquence that surprised those who had dismissed her as merely sentimental. The fight was not cinematic but bureaucratic, messy and often demoralizing. They lost small votes and won others. The outcome, in the end, was a compromise that kept the boathouse public but required them to accept certain restrictions and to find new fundraising models. The victory felt both like a triumph and a lesson in the cost of compromise. Fundraising dinners became common. They learned to script their gratitude for donors whose names would appear on plaques but whose values did not always mirror the communities. Tomas developed a taste for making small, private economies look generous in public. A handshake here, a framed photograph there, a shop window with craftwork made by program participants. Marina, who had always been ruthlessly practical about budgets, trained herself in the softer arts of cultivating patrons. They both grew more competent in languages that were once foreign to them: grant speak, the cadence of donor reports, and the gentle diplomacy of asking for favors without seeming needy. The rhythms of their intimacy changed as the boathouse grew. There were nights when Tomas returned after long days with his hands smelling of dust and varnish, and Marina would meet him in the kitchen with something small and sweet and savory to stave off fatigue. There were other nights when she came home late from a donor meeting with her hair messy and his eyes disappointed by a bureaucratic snub. They navigated these days with a mutual fatigue that sometimes became a wedge, a quiet thing that accumulated like lint in the dryer. When that happened, they would insist on a reset. A walk with Lena tucked into a stroller or a dinner at a favorite cafe where they pretended to be strangers trading biographies. Those resets were not perfect, but they worked. They reminded them of the first weeks when they had held hands like a small pact against the world. In the middle of all this, Tomas received an invitation that reached back into the life he had performed before the boathouse, an offer to curate a small exhibition of restored furniture and folk instruments at a museum in another city. The museum's curator had seen Tomas's work and admired the quietness of his repairs, the way he let the object speak rather than forcing it into a new language. Tomas was flattered and terrified. Accepting meant he would need to be away for a month, traveling with crates and catalogs and new anxieties. Declining was possible but felt like refusing the voice that had once saved him. After long conversations that were both pragmatic and intimate, about the budget, about Lena's care, about who would hold the boathouse in his absence, Tomas accepted. His absence reopened old fissures and also revealed new capacities. Marina found that being alone with Lena for a longer period required a surrender to routines she had not mastered. Bedtime songs that changed keys, the sudden need to patch a scraped knee, an extra helping of patience when a tantrum arrived at the worst possible hour. Tomas called and sent photographs of the crates and of a theater that smelled of varnish and lemon oil, and Marina sent back updates about the boathouse and short videos of Lena doing the new jump they had taught her that morning. The distance was not dramatic. It was a slow test of trust and of the furniture they had built between them. When Thomas returned, the house felt slightly altered, as if he had left a scent behind that had shifted the furniture's statics. He brought back not only crates but a modest stipend for the commons and an affirmation from the museum that they would like to continue collaborating. He also came back with a small secret. The curator had mentioned a young woman who played a bowed guitar like someone whispering to the dark, and Thomas had found himself moved in a way that surprised him. He mentioned the musician, the way her hands trembled over the strings and the way the room had gone quiet, but he did not overstate anything, and Marina, who had learned to read the small motions in his face, did not pry. They had created, from the beginning, a place where curiosity could exist without accusation. Years accumulated, and with them an accumulation of small archives, a shelf of photographs, a tin of concert tickets, a jar of sea glass found on riverside walks. They celebrated anniversaries not with a spectacle but with a ritual that grew a language of its own. Each year they chose a small object to renew their agreement: a faded scarf, a chipped ceramic cup, a song that they would learn together. The objects were tokens of continuity rather than talismans of possession. When Lena was 6, they planted a small chestnut tree behind the boathouse. It was a clumsy thing at first, staking and watering and discussions about how best to protect it from the city's trampling feet, but by the time Lena was 10, it had grown into a slender sentinel that shaded the benches where late-night conversations often took place. The boathouse's reputation spread in modest, interesting ways. One winter, a troupe of dancers from a northern city came to perform a piece about weather and migration, and they asked to use the boathouse as a rehearsal space. Marina negotiated lodging for them in a quirky arrangement that brought fresh faces and new vocabularies into the commons. The troupe's lead dancer, a woman with a laugh like a small bell, became a friend and then an ally in advocacy. When the next developer pitched a plan that threatened to privatize a different stretch of riverbank, these alliances taught Marina and Tomas that community work was not static. It was a set of relations that needed tending and renewal. There were also quieter betrayals. An intern who had been given keys to the boathouse absconded with a small fund meant for a youth workshop, and the discovery led to a legal tangle that cost them time and goodwill. A counselor who had once been a champion of their project found himself embroiled in a scandal and withdrew his support. These were not tragedies so much as structural realities. Public work requires constant repair. Each scandal demanded new forms of transparency and a clearer rendering of who benefited and who paid. As they handled these fractures, the personal contour of their marriage deepened. They learned how to deliver bad news with grace and how to ask for help without shame. Marina, who had been the one to draft their early list of rules, began to edit it. The pact that had once been a pragmatic page of conditions evolved into a living document that included a clause for sabbaticals, a clause for how to handle public recognition, and a clause that explicitly named their right to private grief. They developed an annual practice of listening weeks, days when each would take a turn to lead without interruption, to speak about fear and desire and work and to be heard. The practice was less about decision-making than it was about preserving the sense that each voice had an honored place. Time brought small sorrows. Thomas's uncle died, and with him a series of obligations that required Thomas to travel for funeral rites and family gatherings. The ritual returned Thomas to the old patterns of his upbringing, the measured silences, the careful bearing, and Marina attended whenever she could, learning how to stand with a family whose languages she had partially adopted. She brought soup and flowers and stories of the boathouse that made the relatives laugh and sometimes unbuckle emotions they had kept buttoned. They faced also the quiet erosion of youthful energy. Days when the body was less eager to sprint for a last-minute repair, nights when the joints required a different kind of tenderness, arrived like slow weather changes. They learned to invent intimacies that worked within new constraints, more massages, a growing library of low effort but deep delight, recordings of poets reading in low voices, a repertoire of short walks that always ended at the same cafe, and a mutual agreement to avoid the most exhausting festivals. They found that erotic life did not thin because of stamina, it changed shape. A hand across a knitting project could be as electric as a kiss at midnight when it was framed by shared histories. The city itself changed. Cafes that had once been cheap and easy became trendier and costlier, rents rose in bands that left some neighbors scrambling. The boathouse's role became more explicitly political. They were asked to provide testimony at council hearings about the consequences of gentrification and displacement. The work required an addition of skills, policy briefs, media training, and a steadier voice in public forums. It made them more visible and also more vulnerable. Visibility brought with it a surprising invitation. A small publishing house, noticing the appetite for their community stories, approached Marina with a proposal to collect essays and oral histories into a book. The proposal appealed to her in ways she had not anticipated. The thought of capturing the voices of the people who had shaped the boathouse felt like a way to anchor their work. Thomas, who had always been better with wood than words, found himself practicing interviews and asking careful questions. They spent an autumn gathering stories of an old man who remembered the river before the boathouse, of a woman who had danced in the first winter festival, of a teen who had learned to fix a bicycle and then changed schools. The book became a kind of shared ledger of memory, a way to protect small histories from erasure. They funded the first print run with a combination of small grants, a crowdfunding campaign, and a private donor who insisted on anonymity. The launch was modest but full of people who had once been only a handful of faces in the crowd. The pressing joy of seeing the community's words bound together outweighed the creeping anxieties about public reception. Reviews were gentle and sincere. Critics praised the project for its honesty and for refusing to romanticize the struggle. By the time Lena was 12, the chestnut tree had become a meeting point for after-school clubs and for quiet conversations about the future. Lena, who had once been an accidental child in their care, grew into a thoughtful young person with a hunger for making things and for insisting that others be given room to do the same. She decided, in a way typical of her small decisiveness, that she wanted to learn carpentry. Thomas became her patient mentor, and Marina became the supplier of snacks and the celebrant of small triumphs. First perfectly sanded board, first successful hinge. Their lives, at this point, were public and private in a newly integrated way. They had learned how to set boundaries that preserved a fragile interior life while opening outwardly in strategic, generous directions. They'd learned also how to say no. A major donor proposed a high-profile collaboration that would have brought global attention but would also have required ceding editorial control of the Commons programming. After long talks and a night of sleeplessness, they declined. The decision cost them some money but preserved the Commons' voice. Not all stories end with a tidy reconciliation. Not all arguments are resolved by compromise. There were episodes of real anger, shouts in the kitchen about misplaced keys or about a report that had been filed incorrectly. Once, an argument about how to manage a publicity crisis escalated into a cold week where they slept in separate rooms as a matter of principle rather than punishment. The distance felt like a bruise. They spoke finally in the morning over a mug of coffee that had gone cold, and the reconciliation was neither cinematic nor clean. It involved apology and silence and a small, awkward attempt at humor. It worked because they had accumulated enough ordinary trust to carry them through. The years also taught them to grieve and to make space for the grief of others. A young volunteer with a brilliant, wry sense of humor, someone who had been a fixture at the kitchen and who had taught a generation of teens to use words like small hammers, died suddenly. The community gathered under the chestnut tree with candles and with the awkwardness of people who had never performed grief publicly before. They made a small altar of photographs and of the volunteers' favorite snacks and read aloud poems and memories. Marina, who had been the one to cook for so many funerals and farewells, found herself writing the first words of a eulogy and then stumbling, and Thomas stood beside her with a steady hand. In quieter moments, they talked about the future with an honesty that was sometimes startling. They imagined a time when they would not be able to climb the narrow steps of the attic bedroom, when Lena might marry or move away, when the boathouse might be run by a new generation. Rather than fearing the end, they made plans to preserve the commons ethos. They began mentoring a cohort of young leaders and drew up a rudimentary manual that included both governance structures and a list of values. They formalized a small trust, a way to permit the work to continue in some measure even if they had to step back. The trust did not replace the messy, immediate work of holding a community together. It simply offered a mechanism that could protect some of the essentials. They put together a rotating committee with representatives from the neighborhood and from the artistic community, and they insisted that at least 2 of the committee members be under 30. The arrangement was imperfect and occasionally infuriating, but it did what it needed to do. It distributed authority and offered mentorship opportunities. At some point, as they grew older, Marina noticed that Thomas's hands had more shallow lines and more pronounced knuckles than she remembered. There were new aches he would not mention at the table, and she learned to prepare dinners that did not demand too much labor. He began to wear, more often, a sweater of hers, an old thing that had shrunk in the wash, because it comforted him in a way she found endearing. In those small, domestic changes she found a kind of proof of time's passage and of a love that adapted. One of the last public projects they organized together was a city-wide river week, a series of events that celebrated the river's history and imagined its future as a shared resource rather than a line to be parceled off. Schools came to visit, and the boathouse hosted workshops on water quality and on how to read the river's weather. Tina, now a staffer at the municipality, gave a talk about policy reform. Lena performed a short piece about the chestnut tree. The week drew crowds and small controversies in equal measure. Some activists argued that a festival could not substitute for policy change, and they were right. But the week did what the boathouse had always done best. It made space for people to meet one another. Years settled into a kind of domestic grace. They found that old rituals, coffee at 7, a weekly dance class, a file of unlabeled photographs, were not anchors that held them back but threads that stitched their days. One evening they sat on the chestnut tree's bench and read from the book they'd published years before. The neighbors sat in a loose ring, a mix of ages and languages, and they listened as Marina read a passage about a winter festival and the strange, tender ways humans find to be generous. Thomas closed his eyes in the sunlight and then opened them to meet hers. He leaned across, took her hand, and made a small joke about the weather. She laughed, the sound like a soft bell. They had learned to be tender without greed. They never achieved a mythical perfection. People continued to leave and to arrive, the city continued to change. But the small rituals and the policy of kindness they'd invented together had become part of the city's texture. The boathouse, much to their moderate astonishment, lasted its first 2 decades. It survived a flood, a contentious election, and the inevitable churn of cultural trends. In the end, the thing they had built was not a monument, but a place where small kindnesses accreted like shells on a shore. And when, after many years, they found themselves with more gray at their temples and slower steps, they still held to the principle that had guided them from the start, that partnership was an act of daily courage, that appearing for someone else, sometimes in small ways, was the truest measure of love. Lena, now an apprentice turned craftsman, would sit with them and teach a workshop or serve soup at a benefit. The chestnut tree shaded a new crop of dancers and children. The ledger they had once thought of as a set of practical transactions had, in time, filled with pages of practice, of forgiveness, of astonishment, of mundane yet persistent tenderness. At the end of a long summer, as the light thinned and the heat retreated, Marina and Thomas sat on their terrace with 2 cups of coffee and a small book of poems. They read for a while, sometimes aloud and sometimes in companionable silence. When the sun dipped below the black line of the river and the first lights blinked on across the water, Thomas turned to Marina and said, simply, "We did all right." She looked at him and then at the river and then at the small garland of shells Lena had made and said, "We did more than that." They smiled, and the house, like an old lamp, gave back a familiar, warm light,